So just to establish the foundations of the different questions that I would like to ask you, how do you define trust in active inference terms? What is happening biologically and mathematically when an agent decides to trust?
That is a broad question. I think you could read trust at a number of different levels. First of all, it's the trust in your inferences, and your inferences can be about different things. So it could be the trust read as confidence. And confidence about what? Well, confidence about states of affairs in the outside world at many, many different levels. Your sort of family, your physical body, your institution, the markets. You are in the game of inferring states of affairs, the latent causes, sometimes called hidden states, because you don't have direct access to them other than the way that you measure them or you sense them with your sense organs. So that would be one kind of trust. There's another important kind of trust when considered through the lens of active inference, and that's trust in your own future. So now we're talking about planning as inference. So not inferring states of affairs in the moment, but states of affairs contingent or conditional upon what I am going to do. Sometimes in artificial intelligence, machine learning, this would be called a policy. So you can imagine as an agent different policies, and then you can roll out into the future under some world model or generative model, evaluate the outcomes or the consequences of behaving in this way or that way. And then you can build beliefs about, and when I use the word beliefs, these are not declarative beliefs. These are just probability distributions that are somehow encoded either subconsciously or possibly consciously in our brains. So we build another probability distribution, not about states of affairs of the world, but about what we're going to do. So I can trust myself, or I can trust my commitment to this policy or to that policy to a greater or lesser extent. And that's a really important part of this foundational but quite elemental level of trust. If I know exactly what I'm going to do, because it resolves uncertainty, it resolves an expected surprise, then I'm very confident, I trust myself, and I commit to doing that. If, on the other hand, I don't have a clear picture of the future, uncertainty accumulates the further I go into the future, then I don't know what to do. And I have a low precision or a low confidence and a low trust in my beliefs about how to act next. And that can, in a psychological or psychiatric context, that can be very upsetting. That can induce sort of angst and anxiety. And if over long periods of time you have this irreducible uncertainty about the way to behave, then that can lead to chronic stress and all sorts of pathologies. You know, say you move to a new city or you change job, but you just can't seem to model what's going on or know what to do. And that can be very, very stressful. So that would be one sort of mathematical, elemental kind of trust, read as confidence. Precision is the technical term. If you wanted to get right into the information theory with a neg entropy, it'll be the sort of, if you imagine some probability distribution or Bayesian belief having a bell-shaped character, then something that's very precise has a very narrow shape. So you know with high precision, with high confidence, that the outcome's going to be at some limited range. A low precision means you're very uncertain. You have a highly entropic state of mind about either states or policies. There is another way of talking about trust, which is more anthropomorphic, and this speaks to the imperatives for our behavior, and more specifically, again, this is purely from the perspective of active inference and the free energy principle. Under those commitments, we evaluate the likelihood that we're going to behave in this way or that way in terms of the expected surprise or uncertainty that would accrue if we chose this course of action as opposed to that course of action. So what's the expected surprise or the uncertainty? Well, there are two ways that we can minimize expected surprise or uncertainty. We can either act epistemically, we can be information seeking, we can respond to epistemic affordances, sometimes called intrinsic motivation, to search out that information which would resolve uncertainty about the situation or the context in which I'm operating. So if we take the example of moving to a new city, you might spend the first few days trying to find out where the local coffee shop is, where the shops are, the buses, the local transport. It's literally just exploring, information seeking, responding to these epistemic affordances and novelty. And that mathematically is referred to as expected information gain. There is another important way of minimizing expected surprise, in the sense you don't want to put yourself in a surprising situation, which would be surprising for you. So if you believe that you are a good citizen, rich and loved, you are going to be surprised if you encounter an outcome dependent upon the way you act that is unlikely or surprising under those prior beliefs about, being poor or lonely. These will be very surprising, aversive outcomes. So we have these two imperatives or ways of scoring a particular policy. One is the expected information gain, and the other one is the expected surprise or value or utility, if you're an economist. The reason I sort of unpack, and technically this would be both of those things together, are called expected free energy, but we don't need to know that. But the reason I am unpacking these fundamental imperatives for choosing what to do next for our choice behavior is that the expected information gain is really interesting in the current world, because what it means is you have to choose where to get your news. You have to choose who to trust. And then we get to this notion of epistemic trust, that I trust this source of information as opposed to that source of information. And I have to carefully choose what kind of information I'm going to use in order to resolve my uncertainty about my current world. And this operates exactly as you set up in the introduction. This is a scale invariant phenomenon. It occurs at every scale. So, one of my favorite examples of this is we are incredibly skillful every quarter of a second in sampling information that resolves the greatest amount of uncertainty, has the greatest expected information gain just by moving our eyes. We have in front of us a visual scene that could be caused by all sorts of latent causes, objects, things in the environment. But we only can see a small part of it. We can only look at it with high resolution, the central few degrees. So we have to choose very carefully where to look next. And we do this every 250 milliseconds. And what we do is we look to those parts of the visual scene that resolve the most uncertainty about the current context, to render us situationally aware by evaluating the trust we have. If I looked over there, I would be able to resolve uncertainty about whether this was an aeroplane or a bird or a leaf, for example. That exactly the same mechanics operates at every scale, right through to what particular social media do you trust? What particular news channels do you trust? What authorities do you trust? What institutions do you trust? So all of these things you have to carefully evaluate in terms of how much information gain do I expect if I turn to this source of information. So this is, I think, a much more sophisticated kind of trust. It's the trust in sources of information that are consequent upon your actions, as opposed to the trust that I have in my beliefs about the state of the world and how I'm going to respond to that with policies. So that's mathematically, at least, how we conceive of trust. And you can see it's multifaceted, and every aspect depends upon every other aspect, but they all work hand in hand, exactly as you say, to minimize expected surprise that could be thought of as uncertainty. When you're talking about the free energy principle, the free energy in and of itself is just a way of scoring the uncertainty and the surprise currently in play.
Indeed. And it seems to me like trust is a meta-judgment of your previous prediction, because to the degree to which your previous predictions have been able to cohere or converge with reality, or they have matched what you were expecting, it is the degree to which you now make a narrower prediction. That an hour prediction would be the definition of trust. If you trust something, you are making a big bet on a narrow set of occurrences. That would be the definition of trust. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. That sort of meta or second order aspect, we could talk about that from a number of different perspectives. We could talk about metacognition. We could also talk about it mathematically in terms of data analysts, people in financial technology, fintech. We could talk about it in terms of statistics. So that's a really fundamental point. So well, let's take the statistics perspective. So if I wanted to make a bet, I'm going to have to evaluate the uncertainty about the outcomes in order to make an inference, to choose between one thing and another thing. And not only do I have to estimate the outcomes in terms of, say, the monetary reward or the return on investment. I also have to estimate the risk or the uncertainty. So if I was a statistician, this would be basically evaluating a t-statistic, for example. I'd need the difference in the averages, let's say in a group mean. But in order to form the t-statistic, I also need the standard error. I need a measure of risk or uncertainty or dispersion. And all of those things are the inverse precision. So I need to estimate the precision. And that's usually the more difficult job, certainly statistically and certainly for the brain, to estimate, to quantify our uncertainty, to estimate the precision of all of these beliefs so that I can weight the sources of evidence in proportion to their precision or the confidence I place in them is a really important faculty, certainly from the point of view of cognitive neuroscience, but also in just basic statistics. So that is interesting because the precision is a second-order statistic. It is literally a second-order kind of inference. And you could also say it's a meta-inference. It's on side of. Not only do I have to estimate the average, but I also have to estimate the second-order statistics in terms of the precision or the inverse dispersion. That perspective, I repeat, can be unpacked in many, many different ways. You could talk to people like Steve Fleming who talk about metacognition and knowing oneself and inferring one's states of mind, inferring how uncertain I am and what that means for self-modeling. There's another really interesting line of argument here, which you'll find in fields like computational psychiatry. And this is answers to the question, what happens if this kind of second-order inference goes wrong? So now we're talking about disorders that can be explained in terms of the kind of false inference you get when you have a failure of this kind of metacognition or meta-inference or second-order inference. And they can be quite pernicious if we think about this from a purely clinical point of view and then think about the homologue, say, in finance or in geopolitics. If I am the kind of person who is unable to estimate my standard error or my precision properly, I can never make the right kind of inferences about the causes of my sensory data, which means that I am liable to going to be exposed to false inferences. And by false inferences, I mean exactly what you'd have done at school, and I can guarantee you've forgotten now, which was type 1 and type 2 errors. So type 1 errors are basically inferring something is there when it's not, a sort of false positive kind of thing. And that's, from the psychiatric point of view, a beautiful description of hallucinations, of delusions, thinking something is there when it's not there. And then there's the converse, which are the type 2 errors or the false negatives, which means that I'm starting to infer something is there when it's not. Sorry, something is not there when it is. And that, again, a very apt description of things like neglect syndromes. In psychiatry, these would be called dissociative syndromes. In neurology, there would be sort of hemi-neglect. In the old days, it would be called hysterical symptoms. So this provides a really nice mathematical, effectively trust-based ontology of the ways in which inference schemes can go wrong. And it all rests exactly on this ability to estimate the precision and how much trust we place in this kind of news or this kind of sensory information. And then you start to think, well, if this kind of mechanics, this sort of inferential Bayesian mechanics, is characteristic at every scale for everything, which is the premise of the free energy principle, then you should be able to find this kind of thing in the markets, for example, or you should be able to find this kind of thing in geopolitics, right through to warfare. You should find the same mechanics going on, where you can find basically homologues of delusional institutions that are delusional because they failed to properly quantify their uncertainty in the right kind of way. So there are lots of sort of interesting applications of this underlying, and I repeat, Bayesian mechanics I repeat the phrase Bayesian mechanics. Bayesian mechanics is just the mechanics you get from the free energy principle that is analogous to or comparable to things like quantum mechanics or statistical mechanics or classical mechanics of a sort of Newtonian sort. So it's very fundamental. And to my mind, the particular aspect of precision read as trust or confidence is probably one of the most important aspects of inference when explaining behavior. If you were a psychologist, this basically could be described as the ability to attend properly, in the sense that if I place more trust in this kind of information as opposed to some other kind of information, then effectively I'm attending to this. So we were talking before about choosing the right news channel or choosing the right modality of sensations or the right source of content or data. Effectively, what you're doing is you're paying attention to that. In trusting it, you're paying attention to it. You're privileging that source information in terms of its ability now to cause you to change your mind, technically to engage or induce belief updating under your world model. I mention that because the notion of attention, I think, again, speaks to this sort of metacognitive aspect. Once you're now in charge of what you can attend to, then you've got sort of action on the inside. And it's a nice metaphor, I think, for thinking about the ways that you could fail to attend to the right kinds of things at an institutional level.
Exactly. And just to get a sense of how deep this theory is and how it's just omnipresent, because I don't think there's a orthogonal way of having anything to do with the universe without describing this, at least in an indirect way. This is prediction making and updating your priors. This is basically natural selection and evolution. Our biologies are predictions at all the levels: the skin color, the size of the eye, the thickness of the skin, the organs, what they're doing. They're basically making predictions existentially. And this is ultimately where it goes. All predictions are predictions of the existence of the prediction. If you have a prediction that can arrange its environment in a way to duplicate or replicate again the prediction, that's itself what happens. But I wanted to give some background of how this, I think you're rediscovering evolution and natural selection from a different perspective. And when you have this kind of insight into something so deep, you start finding convergence with other theories that are extremely deep. And I mean deep by describing a lot with very little. And this is the kind of theory, because if you make the wrong prediction, you are able to make less predictions in the future because you don't have the substrate on which to run that software. So if the software is wrong, you lose the hardware to run it on. So all the predictions are basically predicting their own existence in the best way they can. And the example you gave is a very appropriate way because it illustrates this perfectly. The people now have to choose which kind of news they get. And many times they are not predicting the rightness of the news, but the social acceptance they would get from the environment. But ultimately, they're always predicting their own existence. They think that doing that will be the best for them. If you ask them explicitly, do you think your news source is the least biased? Many people would say no. I think that it is pretty biased. Other people would say yes, it is quite biased. But I think as a general principle, the prediction making and correction that you are describing with your model and your free energy principle, which is basically entropy and the degree to which your previous predictions haven't matched your observations, is just something that I'm very interested in, and it's so deep of nature. I haven't seen this kind of theory many times in my life.
Right. Good. All right. I've only seen it a couple of times myself. You brought up so many important points there, and it'd be nice not to lose them. And I can't remember all the important points you made, but I'll try and just quickly list them again. That insight that there is a deep connection with things like natural selection is, I think, really important. And indeed, this Bayesian mechanics entails something called Bayesian model selection. It basically says that if I have a number of hypotheses or generative models, this would be the substrate under which you're making your predictions or making your inferences, and I want to choose the best one, then I'm going to score it in relation to the free energy, or which is just a word for the surprise, which is just a word for the self-information, which is just another way of describing the negative log or the inverse or the complement of marginal likelihood, which is another way of describing the model evidence. I put all those things out there because there's also a lot of confusion. All these things are the same thing. So as you minimize your expected surprise, you are also maximizing your expected model evidence. And you choose the model that has the greatest evidence. And this is called Bayesian model selection. And of course, now what you have is a mathematical metaphor or image of natural selection. So natural selection just is nature's way of doing Bayesian model selection. So now you, the phenotype, you and me, we are just hypotheses that natural selection is saying, is this particular phenotype fit for purpose? Does it fit this particular eco-niche that these phenotypes have co-constructed together? And you will evaluate their adaptive fitness simply in terms of the model evidence, the likelihood, sometimes called the marginal likelihood, that you'll find this kind of phenotype in this kind of niche. It's all the same thing, absolutely. And it leads to the notion that we are the products of experiments and Bayesian model selection for finding the right phenotype that I'm likely to find in this environment. As you say, the very fact that we have a certain sensitivity to different wavelengths in terms of the way that we inherit our, the composition of the sensory organs in our eyes, for example, the sensory epithelium in our eyes, is a testament to the fact that natural selection has found, well, this particular universe is bathed in light with these wavelengths, and everything about our phenotype is tuned and optimized for the environment in which we find ourselves. And then you went on. Remind me what else you were saying, because there were some great points there.
The conversions that we are talking of, not just two different things, but one, and
yes,
that increases our level of certainty.
Yeah, and just to point out on that sort of convergence of different theories, I always find it interesting, and this is slightly tongue-in-cheek or jokey, but the natural selection and the free energy principle share one thing. They both comply with themselves, in the sense that natural selection has itself evolved, in the same sense that the free energy principle just is a description of trying to explain everything as accurately as possible, but in the simplest way, by minimizing the complexity. That rests upon the fact that this log evidence or marginal likelihood or adaptive fitness is equal to accuracy minus complexity. So you were saying that one way of looking at convergence in a sort of philosophy of science sense is that the free energy principle provides explanations for everything as simply as possible. And that often means noting that these two things are in fact the same. These two formulations are exactly the same. But you also, I have a feeling there were at least three other points you made, which I thought should be celebrated. Can you remember what they were?
No worries. I'm also blanking on what I said. We could re-listen to our conversation if it's of relevance, but I wanted to pose it to you whether you know who Donald Hoffman is. He wrote the case against reality.
Yes, I'm hopefully going to do a podcast with him for the first time. I've never appeared on a panel or on a podcast with him. Somebody has arranged for us to have a discourse, so I can ask him about his most recent work. And so I do know him. I know him vicariously. I don't know him personally. So he also is a correspondent and colleague of my friend and colleagues, Mike Levin and Chris Fields, in France and America, respectively. So there's a lot of convergence there between Donald Hoffman's ideas and those ideas. I just remembered one important thing that you did say, which actually is also a cornerstone of these theoreticians who know Donald, which is this notion of mortal computation, trying to elude neuronal chauvinism when looking for the basic principles of self-organization and intelligent behavior at different scales beyond the brain, at an institutional level, right down to the level of intracellular dynamics, without neurons, without nerve cells, without brains. You find this Bayesian mechanics everywhere. And you made the really important point, which was it's substrate dependent. We are the substrate. So I think you articulated that very beautifully. When predicting ourselves into existence, we are the machinery that enables the prediction. We become the model of the lived world. And I think that's one really important insight, which means that to be your model, to be if you like, install all the cause-effect structure that you need to install in order to make the right kinds of predictions. And I'm framing it like that with a nod to the good regulator theorem from early theories of cybernetics, for example. The notion that to exist in a controllable environment means that you have to be a good model of the controllable aspects, the degrees of freedom, another nod to the law of requisite variety. And that's quite fundamental. And what that basically means is substrate matters. Your wetware and your hardware and your body, as you're intimating, your eyes and your ears and the way that you're built physically. This is a statement that the substrate just is. The model is the substrate. And if you can predict yourself into existence, you can predict yourself into a sustainable existence, then job done. You will survive physically as your substrate. And it's a really deep insight. And the idea is that the same kind of insight can be applied right down to the level of cellular organization and intercellular communication, self-organization at a sort of microscopic scale, and also to a certain extent at a cosmological scale, a very, very large scale, or an institutional scale, possibly a meteorological scale. But coming back to Donald Hoffman, so one of his stories, and I'm not quite sure which one you like the most, but one of his stories is that everything that we understand and bring to the table in terms of building our world models or our generative models in this substrate-dependent way, or in the spirit of mortal computation, in the words of Geoffrey Hinton, my friend Alex, is just your hypothesis. It's just the basis of inference. And of course, that will include time and space. There is nothing out there in principle from the point of view of the brain as a predictive organ trying to make sense of its lived world. Everything, including time, is a construct, is a hypothesis, including the notion that I am me, or I am a thing. So selfhood in and of itself is just a hypothesis. Everything that you can talk about has to be, if you like, physically encoded in the substrate-dependent way in your body and in your brain for it to exist for you, including yourself.
Exactly. And he points to the things that we ignore or we're not aware of because they were selected out. We have an inability to detect ranges beneath red or above violet. The reason is that most of the light that we get, most of the radiation filtered through the atmosphere that gets into our Earth's surface is in that range. And it's not a coincidence. But I think that his theory that we don't see truth is false. We do see truth. The degree to which we can ignore things and still make our models be right is truth. Whatever can be ignored in existential terms is not true. So you will only attend to the things that make you be able to replicate. The pattern of matter that life is only replicates if it attends to the right things. In that sense, are there things we're not aware of? Yes. Are they existentially relevant? They would have been selected to be able to attend to them if they were indeed relevant. So I didn't want to derange this conversation a bit. I find all these topics way too interesting, but there are so many other questions.
I'm not going to let you get away with that. I want to derange it just a little bit, because that's another really important point. I think you sound as if you've had a philosophical training. I haven't, but I do pick up on that particular point. The notion of truth pointing, I think, is a very dangerous notion. Yet, of course, if we are substrate-dependent mortal computers that comply with the free energy principle and Bayesian mechanics, then there must be something out there that constrains the way that we are built and the inferences that we make. So I think a better philosophical position would be we are machines that are capable of inference to the best explanation, the best prediction. There is no truth, but there is the best one, and it's the best for me, given what I can see of my world. And of course, I can only see a very, very small part of this world. So exactly as you say, it's just inference about those things that matter to me. So remember before I sort of was trying to briefly describe the good regulator theorem, and it's just the controllable aspects, the aspects over which I have control or have control over me, which are relevant. I don't need to see the dark side of the moon. There's no truth pointing or inference of best explanation even on the dark side of the moon. It just doesn't matter. I think that's a really important point, and it sort of takes the pressure off this notion of a skeptical position or a sort of realist position, in the sense that you've got this sort of bidirectional coupling between you and the world in which you are immersed. And that means there has to be some metaphysical reality out there in order for you to synchronize with that world. But of course, you don't see the entire world. You just see what matters. And of course, your sense making and your model of that world is not going to be that world, but it has to have the elemental cause effect structures that enable you to engage in this bidirectional way with the world. I put it like that because sometimes you can sort of elude all the philosophy and the teleology and just think about this from the point of view of dynamical systems. And what we're talking about is something called synchronization of chaos, or generalized synchrony. So the free energy minimizing solution depends upon the synchronization between your brain and what your brain is dealing with, which is something out there. And when the two converge on a synchronization manifold, or they become synchronous in some generalized sense, that is the free energy minimizing solution. And that's true not just for the world in a sort of abstract sense, but noting that my world, certainly, and probably even to a greater extent your world, is composed of other things like me, basically other people. So what we're talking about is that a joint free energy minimizing solution is we all expressing some kind of generalized synchrony where we all become mutually predictable. Because then certainly my pro-social world or my financial world or my familial world now is predictable. And in being predictable, I can survive in this because I'm a substrate-dependent prediction machine. And that really speaks to the importance of communication and coherence between all the denizens of a particular niche, be it a sort of cultural niche or a social niche or a niche on social media, the World Wide Web. And then you can get into an interesting literature of then simulating this and asking what would happen in terms of belief sharing and the attention you pay to in-groups versus out-groups, and the role of echo chambers, for example. All of these are really fascinating aspects of basically how do I make my world as predictable as possible and yet at the same time respond to the epistemic affordances, the hope of information gain, always be in this perpetual balance between listening to people that I think are like me because I imbue them with epistemic trust, and yet being slightly curious about people that are not like me. And that, if you like, dialectic underwrites all sorts of interesting social aspects like polarization, for example, in-group versus out-group, or the granularity of particular political or theological commitments. All rests on people trying to minimize their uncertainty of a particular kind in the context that we're actually co-constructing a niche together, and that you now become the hidden causes of my sensations, and I have to make inferences about you. Then you get into another kind of metacognition or perspective taking and theory of mind and all sorts of wonderful aspects of multi-agent interactions.
Yep. And this interestingly dovetails with the next question I wanted to ask you, because the trust has to be positively veiled in terms of being aligned in interest. I would trust you only if I believe that you have my best interest in mind, or that you are fighting in the right direction, or this table, I would only trust it if I feel like its robustness is going to work in my favor. In the same way, something similar could be done about things internal to us. Do I trust that my liver will keep filtering my blood or not? If I trust it and it doesn't, that's a huge cost. If I don't trust it and then I go through dialysis, that's a bigger cost, but smaller than the prediction error of having thought that the liver was going to work and not work. So we have to maintain a set of services to our bodies for them to work. And when they stop working because of age or sickness, we hire those out of our bodies. So if you don't see, you wear glasses. If you cannot chew, you scramble some eggs. Basically, the whole economy is an externalization of what our organs already were doing for us, pointing in the same direction that life is not that multifaceted. Everything converged in the same direction. This rambling seems to not be connected, but I'm going to make the connection now. Because if the valence of the trust is negative, I do trust that a lion will want to eat me. So the way I will behave with it is very different. If I find it in the forest, I might think of running in another direction or shooting at it if it's a last resort opportunity. There's many behaviors that would make you assume a cost if the valence of the trust is negative. But if it is positive, the cost is minimized. I trust that you will behave properly around me, so you can come here and we can hang out, have a coffee, and it's a wonderful experience. I can predict your behavior and that it will be aligned with my interests. That's the spot of minimization of cost or uncertainty. But if I know you are a bad person or a lion, that's the worst of the persons I can think of, because it wants to chew your head off and you're pretty sure about their willingness to do that, then you have to invest a lot of resources in avoiding that from happening. This is an omnipresent feature, as we talked about before, that also applies to our society. And the ways in which trust emerges, so if someone is very skeptical of mainstream media, they would say, oh, I don't trust BBC, or I kind of think now of other examples that contrary to BBC, so that I could give a balanced explanation. But if you are consistently thinking that they are wrong, you're shorting them. That's more expensive than if you just had one thing that you could trust and take with you.
Yes, you've been influenced by Trump with the poor old BBC, haven't you?
No.
The world's most...
No, I just to make the caveat clear, my personal political preferences are not being discussed here, not because I don't want to. The mention of BBC, I could have given any other one. It was the first one that came to mind. I have no animosity to BBC at all.
God, yes, yes, that was evident in the way that you were searching for another one. But it's very difficult. Fox News would probably be the best example.
Probably, yeah.
But these are really current issues, given the current political climate, certainly in America. And proposed drift to autocracy and the use of the notion of using fake news and sort of deed as we're talking, rows between Paramount and Netflix and the takeover of Warner Brothers, who own CNN and CBS. So these are really important issues in terms of engineering epistemic trust and diverting it. We could wax lyrical about the three pillars of autocracy. So from an academic point of view or a theoretical point of view, again, I think that's a really important issue. This notion of, if you are like me, then we can synchronize and we can be mutually predictable. But how do I know that you are like me? I'm going to sort of respond to that using the sort of dynamical systems perspective of generalized synchrony. So assuming that the goal here is to find some convergence that allows me to be as predictable as possible for you and vice versa, so that we're now mutually predictable. One really simple solution to that joint free energy minimizing minima is if we share the same generative model. If we share the same world model, then we both become mutually predictable and surprise minimizing, and we can both trust each other. What does that mean? Well, the generative model technically has lots of moving parts in it, but broadly speaking, they can be divided into sort of beliefs about the likelihood of seeing or measuring or encountering this, given my beliefs about the causes of that sensory outcome or that measurement. And then the other really important, so 99.9%, is the priors. And some of those priors are the ones that determine the surprise I would encounter if I acted like this or like that. These are my, if you like, the things that characterize or define me as the kind of thing that I am. So I have to have as part of my generative model, and specifically part of my priors, again, mathematical Bayesian beliefs, priors about what I would find surprising. I am defining myself in terms of the states that I do not occupy, like being eaten by a lion. And I can do that just by defining a probability distribution over all the kind of outcomes I could encounter. And there's a limited range of characteristic states that have a high probability, that are unsurprising, and then a vast number of states that I would find extremely surprising. So to quote the meme, there are many more ways of being dead than there are being alive. And being alive, characterized by these particular states that define the kind of thing that I am, are scored by the higher non-surprising probability distribution. So this has to be in play. If we share the same generative models, we effectively share the same preferences and the same goals. And then if we do, then we can synchronize and collapse onto, play together on the synchronization manifold. If we don't, then the problems that you just described will ensue. In one sense, though, if I can infer your preferences, that underwrite your goals and your intentions, that are part of this expected surprise that gets into the policy selection we were talking about before, and they are not like me, I can certainly now simulate an interaction and ensure that I take actions in relation to you that leave me in an unsurprising, rewarding, a non-aversive state of being. And that could include, of course, running away from the line. I would put it another way. I would be very surprised to find something like me not running away from a lion. I know that, and that's why I just choose the policy, run away from lions. And why would I be surprised not to run away from a lion? Because I now know that the lion's preferences, or at least I infer, or I have been taught, that the lion's preferences are to make me very surprised by eating me. It's a really interesting, if you like, reduction of the nature of our transactions and interactions that rests upon the alignment of our prior preferences that fundamentally underwrite the kind of thing that we think we are, or that we are actually because of this substrate dependent aspect. I use the word alignment here because, of course, these issues are going to be quite prescient when it comes to aligning artificial intelligence with natural intelligence, namely ourselves. Coming back to the fake news and epistemic trust afforded various sources of information, you could simply reduce that to, is this source of information generated by somebody like me? If it is, then you can assume that it is now our preferences and it is our generative model and our prior or characteristic beliefs that are responsible for this communicative exchange, you telling me your news or me telling you my news. And that's going to work perfectly, provided we do listen to people like us. So we come back to the echo chamber argument. That's completely base optimal. It only fails when you realize that, in fact, communities are not closed. If we had closed communities, then we could attain that kind of thermodynamic equilibrium you learnt about at school, where we all become effectively homogenized and at a steady state equilibrium, as opposed to a non-equilibrium steady state, where we all converge on the same preferences and the same generative models. They have something called identical synchronization, generalized synchrony or synchronization of chaos, because it doesn't work like that. Any given eco-niche has all sorts of different things, ranging from molecules of oxygen, for example. You introduced some really nice examples about livers, and there are lots and lots of different moving parts that provide any given eco-niche, whether it's a bodily niche or whether it's an institutional niche, which all need to sort of reconcile with their different kinds of preferences at different levels. And of course, even if there was a homogenous community on the World Wide Web, for example, there are other communities around that are not the same. Again, we come back to this: how do we minimize our surprise? How are we trust seeking in a world where, in a capricious world, where we have to infer the degree of epistemic trust we ascribe to different sources of evidence when there are so many choices in that ascription or that choice? And then you get into arguments about globalization, connectivity, just having too many choices, which makes that sort of choosing the right source of information, placing your epistemic trust or evaluating the expected information gain extremely difficult. And it must be awful for young people nowadays. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, obviously the BBC would be exactly the place you turn to. That's where the real news was. I suspect that both you and I think that is still the case. But young people probably do not appreciate that. They're faced with many more choices. When I say young people, I should tell you, I don't possess a mobile phone. I'm not on social media, so I don't expose myself to this awful uncertainty that we were talking about right at the beginning of the conversation, which is basically, what should I do? If most of what I do is information seeking, it's responding to the right epistemic affordances, then the range of things that I can do determines the uncertainty or the inverse trust in what I'm going to do next. And that can be, as I say, very negatively valenced. So not quite the negative valence that you're talking about. I think you were talking about the valence of the expected surprise about the outcomes given the kind of thing I am in relation to my prior preferences. But there's another kind of valence, which is that the second order valence, which is about the trust I have in what I'm going to do, which is where we started. I can imagine that there are conversations around the world at the moment about the benefits of restricting social media in young people. Say, for example, in Australia, literally yesterday, the regulations came into effect restricting the use of social media in people under the age of 16. And of course, on one level, that's going to make their life much easier because they don't have the latitude and the choice now, which means that their uncertainty about what they're going to do is reduced, which means at some elemental level, they can now trust what they're going to do in the future. Of course, there are counter arguments in terms of being able to contact your friends in the outback. But from a purely maths perspective, that is a really important aspect of establishing this elemental kind of trust in what am I going to do next? How can I trust myself in terms of choosing what the most appropriate way to act is?
This is interestingly exactly what happens in the market with capital, but in this case with information. We have beings in our society, people under 16 in Australia has been judged, that are not as capable of dealing with the massive amounts of information shared in social media. Maybe it's not about the quantity itself, but about the quality also, because the way they are selected for, what leads, maybe there's some kind of bias there. But I see an analogy here that the people who are not capable of dealing with as much information should be exposed to less information. We find this perfect analogy in finance. If you manage a fund with 10 million pounds and you do it successfully, you will have a profit and you will attract more capital and you will handle more. So you self-limit. But interestingly, with information, there's a pathology in there which makes kids want to handle more than they can. And of course, the same thing would happen with hedge fund managers. But when they have a loss, they are self-corrected. They're proving their incompetence. You stretch yourself too far. But in the case of the kids, that stretching too far doesn't have an external cost that people are willing to stop the financing, but internally, you deteriorate your mental health, and that is even worse because it attracts more capital. You want to spend more time in social media to correct for those bad experiences that you had, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way that in the market, it's not to the same extent. So I don't know if this analogy would be perfect, but I found it very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful analogy. I mean, the markets are mature. They are self-limiting, self-correcting. They're a beautiful example of a self-organizing system, very much like the weather. But of course, from a generational point of view, social media is not. It's still, I've heard it said that sort of it's in its pre-adolescent stage. Societally, there was, as a species, a very early stage of development in terms of how we handle social media and this unlimited access to interpersonal exchange on social media, on the World Wide Web more generally. But markets, of course, they've been around for centuries. So I think they're grown up and they put their own sort of guardrails in place. They have a good self-model at some sort of abstract level, which means that they are self-correcting in exactly the way that you very eloquently described.
Interesting. And I think that this could be analogized to scientific method, because the more sources of evidence you get, the more they can contrast with each other, and the more there's a variance in fitness that emerges out of the different versions of the different theories we have. So if I believe one thing and you believe another one, and we're subject to enough time and space to be able to test our hypothesis, the existence of the theory will prove its rightness. I'm not particularly religious, but when I see that many religious people have more kids, I end up believing that they must be into something if they're able to keep their numbers. And we Western secular people are not having as many kids. So they have to be right at some level, at least existentially. Not explicitly, but metaphorically, religion is true, right?
Yes, no, absolutely, yes. I haven't thought about that before, but that's an interesting expression of the importance of having sort of monolithic, simple generative models of the world. If you have a monotheistic commitment of a religious sort, that is very much a free energy minimizing state of being, because you've got this really simple explanation for everything, which means that may well be the best kind of inference. Again, we're not talking, there is no truth pointing. These are all inferences. If that is consistent with cultural niche construction and the kind of lived world that may or may not have some ecclesiastical aspects to it, then exactly as I say, to have that kind of very simple commitment and belief structure, that kind of world model, may be the most adaptively fit in the simple sense that this is the substrate dependent, most likely way of being in this kind of world. That's a really interesting, but it does come back to this interesting connection with the previous part of the conversation, which is narrowing the choice. It is not necessarily a bad thing to narrow your choice so that you don't experience the angst in not being able to trust your beliefs about what you're going to do. In the same way that people in marketing will deliberately reduce the range of options in order to simplify the epistemic uncertainty associated with choosing, do I buy that tomato brand or that tomato or that tomato or that tomato? People don't like that. I say people don't like that. What I mean is that loss of trust in my choice, that loss of precision in my choice, is negatively valenced. It's a pernicious kind of uncertainty. It's uncertainty about what am I going to do? What am I going to choose? Exactly the sort we talked about earlier in terms of some angst and anxiety. So perhaps religion is just basically the right kind of limiting the range and the latitude and the uncertainty about what I commit to and how I lead that part of my life.
I don't know if it was you who said this quote, but if it wasn't from you, I think it's very pertinent for you to know about it. The quote is, "You are your own existence proof." I think this points maybe in a slightly different direction, but by the fact that you exist, you're pointing to the truth of the implicit theories in your existence, in your substrate. So that is a proof. There is a truth pointing. The degree to which we exist is the degree to which we are sure that we understood how the world works, about the predictions that were previous to our existence. But of course, the environment can change and we have to adapt to that. So ultimately, real truth can only be assessed in the infinite time frame in which we are already looking back at everything. But that we will never have that perspective. So everything is updatable. All knowledge is provisional. And in that sense, true. There's no ultimate truth, but there's models that work more than others. I would be very interested in knowing this, what your thoughts are about this. This may be a side point, but it deeply connects with the issue of trust, which is the is and not distinction is a fallacy, in my opinion. Science cannot say what is right morally. I think that statement is wrong, because it can indeed say what is right. Whether you believe that something is ethically correct or not will bias your behavior in one direction. But if you exist less, then there won't be anyone to believe that in the first place. So that theory will be proven wrong existentially. And for you to have a preference, you have to first exist. So first survive, then philosophize. And if your philosophy leads to your non-existence, if there's not an is, there is not a not. So all the odds have to stem from a proper is, and they have to feed into these. If your odds, if the things you're driven by, the values you hold are driving you in a wrong way into an isn't, into a non-existence, then you wouldn't even have that preference in the long term. So I think is and not are the same thing.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And you're right, it was me, well, I'm sure other people said it, but it was one of my favourite sayings that we are our own existence proofs. Job done, there's nothing else we need to say about that. The other phrase I quite like, I am, therefore I think, which is another way of sort of turning the tables. There's something more elemental about being. You can certainly read one aspect of being as thinking and planning and making inferences and the like. I think you've captured in the essence of certainly the free energy principle and possibly also natural selection in its broadest sense. But of course, they're the same thing when we think about Bayesian model selection. Everything you say sort of rests upon an existence proof in relation to the world in which I am existing. So I think that relational aspect is quite important, because that's what sort of, if you like, gives you the illusion of truth pointing, which I repeat, from the point of view of inference, the best explanation you don't need. But there is a notion of best, and the best depends upon how well you model your world. And of course, the best now depends upon the world and you. So there's an inherently relational aspect. So there's no standalone measure of the goodness of something. It is only right or best in relation to how it survives and synchronizes with the world. And I think that you were making the argument that this is true of scientific theories. And I think that's absolutely right. That the theory is just a hypothesis. It's just very much like we were talking about you and I being phenotypic hypotheses that natural selection is using to find out what's the most apt or adaptively fit for this kind of co-constructed environment. I think exactly the same mechanism applies in the scientific process. And indeed, the maths of understanding from the point of view of the philosophy of science is just Bayesian mechanics. So if you unpack movement in the post-Popperian era to think about how theories survive and don't survive, then it is precisely this kind of Bayesian model selection where the model is the hypothesis or the theory. And the people, I'm not saying that scientists have to live longer in order to get their theories, to instantiate their theories, but the theories themselves living in the literature, living in the sense that they are read. They are read by the next generation or by students, and they are cited, and they live in that particular sense. So by definition, Bayesian model selection will select those. It's just a selective process. So the ones you read about are the ones that have been provide the best explanation, have the greatest evidence in some sense that is realized through being read, through being cited, through being applied, through being developed. I'm not sure about the looking back to the infinite past, because of course, as you say, the world is constantly changing. So this is a process. So Bayesian mechanics, very much like quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics, are descriptions of systems in terms of processes and dynamics. So there is no, if you like, Nevada or sort of steady state endpoint to where we're going. It's just a process that is continually evolving. Having said that, at certain timescales, you can say there's going to be sort of a partial non-equilibrium steady state that over a certain period of time, say a lifetime of something, you and me, for example, I am me for the duration of my lifetime. And being me means that I keep myself to some characteristic states, and those are exactly the states that have this low surprise or high prior preference that underwrite the expected surprise when I choose my actions. So on that view, you could certainly regard the scientific process as yet another instance of this selective process where the substrates now are the Popper's third world, some version of that, where the ideas are basically what is out there that is communicated. You can write down that is installed in artificial generative AI or installed in the literature on some PDF somewhere. These things are living out there, but are subject to exactly the same Bayesian mechanics and selective pressures that you and I are, or indeed any meme that might be.
Okay, let me poke at your brain for one last time. I have the feeling that software and hardware only differ in the speed at which they change. Memes evolved out of genes for a purpose. It gives the genes adaptiveness. It allows us to change our hypothesis or some hypotheses faster than the genes can. So the software in your computer can change faster than the CPU in your computer can. But if the software points in the same direction for long enough, the CPU will change because the next generation of a computer will be changed. The software will stay there. So I feel like these concepts that we're talking about, the substrate and the substance being run on the substrate, are all variations of the same notion of natural selection, random variation, non-random selection based on what is fit. This process describes absolutely everything. I cannot think of an alternative process by which something could emerge. It is monopolizing the universe. There's only this. This is the universe.
Yes, I know. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah. If you wanted to describe that to a physicist or a mathematician, what you're talking about is something called the renormalization group. So what you're saying is that exactly the same mechanics, Lagrangian dynamics, are recapitulated at every scale, all the way up and all the way down ad infinitum. And the same rules apply, and you can read those rules in terms of natural selection. One thing which that insight that you just offered accommodates or foregrounds is that as you move from one scale to the next, and they use scale in the sense of scale free and scale invariance, things get bigger but also slow down. So what you are looking at now is a separation of temporal scales. So the same processes unfolding at different temporal scales. So I liked your analogy of the development of our hardware versus the development of our software. So the software will be developed much more quickly than NVIDIA or people working with memristors or thermodynamic computing chips. The development of the hardware is a much slower process that contextualizes the faster process of software development, very much in the same way that you grow physically slowly, yet at the same time, you are learning quickly, second by second, month by month. So at every time scale, there are belief updating, there is Bayesian mechanics, self-evidencing, as philosophers would like to say, entailed by and contextualized by a slower self-evidencing selective kind of process. I think that's a really important insight, that separation of scales. And one thing, it's sort of, just to come back to the natural selection, but sort of the biotic expression of this in terms of you and me, what often is inherited through the hardware is the learnability. So if you just think about you, what you inherit from your genes and the history of natural selection is not a completely ready-made world model that has running all the right software to deal. You have to spend the first 20, 30 years of your life, and certainly very earnestly the first few months and years of your life, just building the right internal model or world model of what you can move and what can't be moved, what you're in control of, what not, how the world works, what are there things out there separate from you that have agency like mothers. Everything has to be sort of learned. And of course, but you are equipped epigenetically with a capacity to learn this kind of thing. And I think that's how I would read this fast development of the software. So what you're looking at, if you want to take this into, say, artificial intelligence research, you're not trying to design the perfect generative AI. What you need is the software that will self-learn, that will adapt as quickly as possible, in the most efficient way for this generation. And then you'll get the next generation of hardware that will do it even more efficiently, one might suppose.
Yep. Everything you said is wonderful, and I agree with it. One little point. So I think that foolishness has been selected for. The reason why it takes us 30 years to learn, and our prefrontal cortex, 25 years. I'm about to get into my prefrontal cortex being fully developed, but I haven't yet, and I'm still 24. So this is an amazing fact of our biology. And I think that the reason is non-coincidentally that when you're young, you can be foolish, and you will be selected out if you do something that is foolish enough. You have high risk, high reward in your teenage years, and there's no resource bottleneck that makes us not be able to develop the prefrontal cortex at the age of 13. That could, in principle, be done. An adult brain doesn't take much more resources. I think that the foolish years of development have to be there so that people do certain behaviors that lead to more offspring, I bet, or more I don't know what exactly, more wars being conducted by people who are more willing to fight than they should. And if you survive that period, then you get to have a more functioning brain. But the deeper principle you were describing is absolutely true. There has to be a development of acquiring the customs and culture of your environment, and to be able to adapt to it. Genetically, you are already adapted as well as we could. We could have darker skin because we get radiated and get the skin cancer, but in principle, we're already pretty adapted, and it is a culture that is lacking.
Yes, and then you could have get into the notion of evolutionary psychology and co-evolution and cultural niche construction, that we actually can inherit our cultures through being cared for, through language and the like, which also has a different time scale, which is absolutely essential. Just in closing, there's a paper written by a friend and colleague many years ago called Jean Denisot and his team, called "Did Evolution Fool Us?" And he uses active inference and simulates active inference agents in exchange, and shows that the evolutionary stable strategy is to have more foolish people, stupid people in the sense of not being very sophisticated, and a small number of very sophisticated people. So I think that's absolutely right. Not only is it useful sometimes to be foolish in this sort of technical sense of not being sophisticated in terms of how many iterations of what do I think you want, what do you think that I think that you want, and so on. So this sort of economic sophistication. And it was interesting that the best outcome for everybody was when most people were very dull-minded, and this had first-order sophistication, but a few people were a bit more sophisticated. So I think that's a nice expression, mathematically at least, of what you were intimating, or one aspect of what you were intimating.
Yes, I promise. Last comment: variance creates arbitrage opportunities. I recently read When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. I have the book here. This is the German version, but I read also the English version. And in this book, Steven Pinker talks about exactly what you were mentioning, the common knowledge. What do you know about what I know, and when the knowledge becomes common. If there's a variance in the sophistication of the thinking, there will be arbitrage opportunities. The people who are the most foolish will take behavior, will behave in some way that the elderly, more mature people won't. But there's even smarter people above those. There has to be a very populated, very wide spectrum for all of them to be adapted to the environment. It's analogous to why we all differ in the big 5 personality traits, those 5 dimensions, ocean in general. We differ because we have to have a wide range of ways of behaving to be adapted to a wide range of possible environments. It's not a coincidence that there's variance, and it creates arbitrage opportunities, which is exactly what I talk about in the article I will send you. But Karl Friston, it was an absolute pleasure being able to talk with you, and I'm sorry to have talked so enthusiastically about these topics, but I feel like it was very worth it, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. I look forward to reading about arbitrage and the like in the final article. Thank you very much.